Welcome, everyone. I'm Jenny Womack, N4A Division Director of Educational Services and Initiatives and the liaison for the Virtual Education Working Group. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for N4A's second webinar of the 2022-2023 school year. We want to thank the N4A leadership for continuing to support the holistic growth of all N4A professionals and to all of you for investing in your own development. Today's webinar is entitled Riding the Wave, a dive into current NCAA updates and what's next. We feel this conversation is extremely timely given the legislative changes that will go into effect into the 23-24 academic year, as well as the recent release of the Transformation Committee's full report in January. I'm here alongside Virtual Ed Chair Zach Reed and Working Group Member Rachel Rodriguez, who will moderate today's webinar. We're also joined by Working Group Member Cecily Taylor, who will facilitate the Q&A towards the end of today's session. During this session, we will hear from both NCAA staff and experienced practitioners within our field. The NCAA will share updates related to the Eligibility Center, Committee on Academics, and the Transformation Committee. The distinguished senior athletic administrators will unpack the changes and how they will impact the institutional level. If you have questions you would like to submit to our presenters, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. For questions posted in the Q&A that are specific to the NCAA, we will have NCAA Customer Service Representative Connor joining us to address those throughout the webinar. We will also address questions and live questions if time permits during a brief Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Now I will turn it over to the presenters who will each provide a brief introduction.
Hi, and thank you for joining. My name is Kaylin Overway. I'm an assistant director in the Eligibility Center on the high school review team, and I've been with the national office for 4.5 years.
Hi, everyone. Bin Nguyen with the AMA staff, Academic and Membership Affairs staff of the NCAA. I serve as the liaison to the Committee on Academics, as well as N4A's vice chair of the Legislative Subcommittee with Eric Wall.
Hi, everyone. Magdi El-Shahawi, Athletic Director at the University of Georgia. I also, like Ben, serve on the Committee on Academics. Been here at the University of Georgia for 5 years, but also a veteran in the field, serving almost 30 years in the profession.
Good morning and good afternoon from Kansas City, home of the Super Bowl Chiefs. So just had to get that part in. My name is Ursula Gurney. I am the Deputy Athletics Director and Senior Women Administrator here at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. I also am our N4A past president and previously had served on the Committee on Academics and also served on the NCAA Division I and II Standardized Test Task Force. So happy to be here with our N4A membership today.
Thank you, everyone, for those introductions, and we are excited to dive in. I'm now going to hand it over to Rachel to kick off our first segment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much, presenters, for those introductions. Kaylin Overway is ready to get us going, and she's going to share initial eligibility updates, including the removal of the test score requirement and an overview of high school reviews. Our practitioners will also be sharing their thoughts throughout regarding how these changes may impact our roles in the industry moving forward and provide some recommendations on how to navigate this at the institutional level. Kaylin, take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. So during 2021, the NCAA started their Standardized Test Score Task Force to examine the extensive information from a wide range of sources about the use of test scores in our initial eligibility requirements. So this included a historical analysis of how Divisions I and Division II have used the test scores, research from outside scholars on test-related topics, about biases and stereotype threat, presentation from the National Association of College Admissions Counseling on testing history and current trends, as well as their perspectives on the use of ACT and SAT, and then presentations from the test companies themselves. And in the end, issues were raised by many presenters and task force members around the benefits of tests relative to equity concerns, administrative difficulties that became even more evident during COVID-19, as well as international testing units. So the testing companies encouraged the national office and the NCAA Standardized Test Score Task Force to do their own validity study to see whether or not the ACT and SAT tests are useful for our purposes, and that is to establish that minimum standard of for identifying student athletes who are prepared to undertake college level work at Division I and Division II institutions. High school academic performance variables were analyzed for first year success and academic outcomes on those Division I and Division II campuses. We looked at about 30,000 per year per division, and that was for 3 years prior to COVID-19. Next slide, please. So from there, we determined that NCAA research found that the test score did not provide a super great variance on first year success compared to the high school GPA in core academic courses. So in another way, the core academic classes was a better predictor by 3 to 5 times more than the ACT and SAT score. And adding in that ACT and SAT score really only changed that predictive ability by about 1%. So, and these results were consistent when analyzing across men's and women's sports, as well as across racial and ethnic lines. So based on that, the NCAA core course requirements were looked at, and we decided to remove the test score because we're using those core requirements based on course taking patterns of both student athletes and non-student athletes at the high school level, examination of course requirements that are required for admissions into Division I and Division II universities. So we decided to remove that test score piece and focus solely on the core course GPA. Next slide, please. So that puts a lot of weight on that core course GPA and the high school courses that are being used to configure that, which is where our staff at the Eligibility Center, and specifically our high school review staff, comes in. When reviewing schools, we look at accounts and programs and core courses, and I'll dive in a little bit to each one next. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. So starting with high school accounts. So this is our biggest picture. This is the school, and we review these accounts to determine the validity of a high school and the core courses that are coming from it for the purposes of meeting those initial eligibility requirements. So when we're reviewing this, staff considers the presence, frequency, and severity of issues associated with quality control and integrity of information in the 3 following areas: school policies and or operations. So what we do with that is we look at a school's policies on academic integrity, attendance, transcript revisions, repeated courses, all of those school policies and operations that schools have to make them run smoothly, and compare them to, do we trust the information that we're getting from this school? So is the school giving us a policy that is found at another school, and have they changed the names? Are they using the same documents? Those kinds of things is what we're looking at there for the school policies and operations. Then we move into curriculum instruction and assessment. So course assessments are inconsistent with information provided to the NCAA. So here we're looking at information that they've provided for us about their instructional model and how that's run, as well as the curriculum and assessments that they use. So we ask them what curriculums are used, and then we do gather a few sample assessments from their school that are used there, and we compare those. We are well versed in different curriculum providers, and so we're looking, if they say they're using a certain curriculum, but then they give us assignments and assessments that are clearly from a different curriculum, that again adds to those presence and frequency of issues associated with the high school's quality control and integrity of information. And then other areas deemed relevant by the high school review staff. So that could be academically related preferential treatment. Student athletes have a certain set of rules versus a different set of rules for the general public. And just other information that we gather along the way, whether that's from documents submitted to us, whether it's information that we found on the internet, and we just kind of use all of that information to really determine if that high school has that cleared status and if they have any issues with quality control and integrity of information. So once we have that high school account and we're confident in the validity of that school and the information that we're getting, we'll then switch to programs. And that could be traditional in-person or university model where students are coming 3 days a week, or it could be more non-traditional, which we are seeing more of after the COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll talk a little bit about the non-traditional programs next. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So in non-traditional programs, we're determining whether a non-traditional program meets the legislated conditions and may be used to satisfy NCAA core course requirements. So can we use these online programs based on the legislation that has been provided to us to meet the initial eligibility requirements? And we do consider the program itself holistically. So we're looking at all components of the legislation and if they work together. The first piece of legislation that we really look at is the student-teacher interaction. So we're looking, the legislation specifically says that students and instructors must have regular and ongoing access and interaction throughout the duration of the course for all three purposes of teaching, evaluating, and providing assistance. So we ask some questions and we will ask follow-up questions to determine if that student and teacher interaction is happening for all students. So even those students that are excelling and they're not reaching out for help, we make sure that those students are also receiving instruction and that all students are receiving that instruction, that teaching piece, the evaluating, so grading, and then providing assistance whenever it's necessary and throughout the duration of the course, whether that providing assistance is a question about the content or if that providing assistance is a technical issue. So that's the first piece that we're really looking at. The next piece is a defined time period for completion. And so schools have to identify the fastest and the slowest paths to a successful completion of the course. And that we found we put into the legislation because of when online courses really started getting up and running, we were seeing some oddities of courses like pre-calculus being completed in 45 minutes. I don't know about you. I know I definitely couldn't finish any math course in 45 minutes. So we put in that defined time period for completion. Now we don't say what that time period has to be. We just say that schools have to have that in place and a way to enforce that. And that has to pair well with the student and instructor regular and ongoing interaction. If they say that they need to receive interaction weekly, and they get that instruction weekly from instructors, but their defined time period for completion is 3 days. Those don't meet because then they're not meeting for instruction regularly and for the duration of the course. So that's where that holistic review really comes into play. And then finally, to appear on high school lists of approved core courses, the non-traditional courses have to meet the same criteria for review for a core course. They're no different than just your traditional face-to-face class in that manner. Next slide, please. So then we go one level deeper and we're reviewing core courses. So this is to determine whether a core course meets legislated criteria for the purpose of meeting the core curriculum requirement to establish the eligibility at a member institution. First, that course has to be college preparatory in nature. And to review that, we look at the course content as well as the rigor of the assignments and assessments. So that course content, we're looking at what is it that the students are learning from that course? And then the rigor, we're looking at what are they being asked to do with that course? Are they expanding on their learning? Are they going above and beyond just simple rote memorization? And they're actually having to analyze or synthesize different pieces of that content and turn that into new work. Next slide, please. So then we have individual reviews, and these could be done for a variety of reasons, whether it's it's a core course on a high school with an extended evaluation account status, or if it's coming from a school that offers a highly individualized instruction. So we do have some schools that are more independent study and students can kind of design their own classes. And so in those cases, we are looking at those individual courses before they can be used to really look to see if they're meeting that, again, that content in that rigor of the course. And these types of reviews could also be done for homeschool instruction. And so again, we're looking at the criteria for review in the core course, and then in some cases with these individual reviews, do they meet those non-trad legislations where that's applicable? Next slide, please. So now we're going to go into just a little bit of how a core course review or an individual review may be done. And so this is an example of a social science course. So again, for rigor, we're looking at what the student athletes have to do with that content, extended thinking and that skills application. And then the course content includes what they should know. And for a social science course, it often looks like inquiry-based approaches to understanding the social and political or cultural issues. It could be how to evaluate sources and use evidence. So looking at those firsthand sources and using those in document-based questions, we see that in a lot. And then developing questions and planning inquiries to reach conclusions and then take informed actions. And if you ever are working with a high school as they're kind of just figuring out what courses they can upload, next slide, please. You can go into our high school review policies and procedures. Starting on page 40 is an in-depth breakdown for different courses in each content area of what is sufficient for approval and what is not alone sufficient for approval. So I've got an example here of sports history. And this is what each of these boxes looks like for different courses. And we have them broken down for different courses within each content area. And we basically want to see more of what's on the left side in that sufficient for approval column, and less elements of the ones in the right-hand column of the not alone sufficient for approval. And now that's not to say that those elements, such as study of sports from the perspective of a fan and sport enthusiast, those can't be there. We just want to see more content from the left-hand side, and that's looking at that, again, that content piece. And then the rigor comes from looking at sample assessments. So when we are asking for documentation about different courses, we'll ask schools to provide a course description, a unit by unit or week by week outline of content, again, to make sure that all of that content that we want to see in those courses is there, a flow chart of where that course fits in the grand scheme of things. So does your school have Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, or if this is a bridge algebra class, where does that fit? Is it a bridge after Algebra 2? Is it a bridge between Algebra 1 and Geometry? Things like that. And then we ask for sample assessments, and we really ask schools to provide us with assessments that show that rigor. So while it may be easier to give us that final, that's 100 multiple choice questions, that really doesn't show us as much rigor as a writing assignment may show us. So we do ask schools to provide that. And so that sums up my slides. And again, I just wanted to give you all an opportunity to see how we are using the core course GPA and how we get there now that that test score has been removed. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. Really great information, important information as we move forward. I'd like to take a minute or two and have Dr. Magdi and Ursula chime in with your thoughts on what does this mean for us?
Thank you, Rachel. I think, as practitioners, we have been dealing with the elimination of the test score for quite a while now as a result of COVID. But I think one thing to point out as a member of the task force that made the recommendation to eliminate the test score permanently is some of the most influential individuals who talked to us, and there were many. We looked at many angles, was Claude Steele and Jay Rosner. I think that's interesting, their work that they've put forward for our memberships to be aware of. So again, that's Claude Steele and Jay Rosner. So just want to put that forward as we begin to talk about the impact on our association and our membership. So I'll turn it over to Magdi to highlight some of these first points.
Yeah, no, I think the recommendations that came from the standardized test score task force definitely a pathway for all of us understand that the test score predicting first year success is not necessarily valid, and that the core course GPA was a much greater predictor. We all know about cultural bias, the disparate impact that sometimes the test score had on certain groups of student athletes coming to school. The one thing that we see as practitioners that we're still having to deal with is that many of our campuses are still requiring a test score for admission. I know I'm at a state, University of Georgia system does require test scores for admissions. I know we're hearing from our coaches that could impact our coaching recruiting, where certain schools are telling them you don't need a test score, but yet here at the University of Georgia, you still do. Coming into play, as well as on different college campuses, where if you don't have a test score, even if you can get admitted into school, sometimes replacement into college level math or English you may be placed into a remediated score. So we're still trying to work through that over the coming years. It's still early in the process, but these are questions that we have as practitioners right now.
I think also to follow up on Magni's point on just some of the, potential confusion of test scores at a university level. Not only are many universities moving away from it, but not necessarily on the financial aid side. So we have a lot of equivalency sports where we have student athletes who want to get various academic aid from a campus, and maybe a test score is still needed. So I think that level of confusion is also still there. So I think obviously continuing to over communicate as we meet with recruits, student athletes and coaches. Another piece of this is also looking at risk and risk assessment. Obviously using the ACT and SAT was one benchmark, for lack of a better word, that was easier to use to assess risk. So I think it further pushes us, and hopefully we're all still doing this, or we're doing this, is looking at risk on a continuum and looking at multiple factors beyond GPA and SAT to assess the risk of our student athletes. So I think this continues to push us in that direction to look at the whole student athlete and multiple points of risk for those student athletes. And I think another piece from an N4A perspective to continue to be aware of, and perhaps for those of you who are on that may have been around for a while, to put my Dr. Gerald Gurney hat on, there is still an academic red shirt for 2.0 to 2.3, but as we want to keep in mind, there's still nothing really academic about the academic red shirt. And that was brought up in our committee. Obviously, that was not the charge of the task force, but I think as membership, we still want to continue to think about how do we put in some academic metrics into the academic red shirt.
Thank you, Ursula and Dr. Magdi. And again, thank you, Kaylin, for your perspective there. We're going to transition. So now I'd like to hand it over to Binti Nguyen from the NCAA to share some updates on the Committee on Academics. This will include some of the proposed legislation, the latest on the Academic Performance Program, review and recommendations from the Transfer Committee.
Thanks, Zach, and good afternoon, everyone. As Zach mentioned, I did want to provide an update on the Committee on Academics who just met last week. I also want to thank Magdi and Ursula for their service on the committee. We also have fantastic service from Jessica Gerke, who is at Santa Barbara, Rob Carson at Furman, as well as Janice Lavallee from Alabama State, who also provide fantastic practitioner perspectives on the Committee on Academics and the issues that are on their agenda. So as I mentioned, the committee met last week, several items to bring to your attention. The first one is the APP comprehensive review has concluded and the recommendations were put forward to the Committee on Academics. The key question, or the essential question the committee was asked to answer is the APR as well as the GSR and the entirety of the program, is it facilitating academic success in addition to addressing academic underperformance while taking into account the ever-changing environment we are in intercollegiate athletics, whether that be the flexibility in the transfer rules or NIL, which are newer to the landscape of college athletics. And a resounding yes to both questions was provided by the ad hoc group. ENR, eligibility and retention, continues to be a valuable predictor of graduation that should be maintained in its current format. And also the penalty structure and access to postseason is also very important and also a good motivator for academic performance and addressing academic underperformance. So no changes, substantive changes came out of the comprehensive review. However, the most important note is that the committee and also the results we see from the academic performance program over its existence since 2003 continues to bolster the academic performance of our student athletes. Let me pivot real quick to another topic of great interest to you all. Is the committee also agreed to resume the academics performance program, both APR as well as the penalty structure, which has been on pause for 3 years to allow institutions to focus on the COVID pandemic and other things that are going on campus. How this will resume is the data that is submitted this fall from this year will be your 4th year of data. If you take the last 3 years, that will be calculated into your 4-year rate. The public release will occur next spring, and then penalties, if there's any, would apply in 24 and 25. So that will also come out. You may have also read it in the article that was released on NCAA.org last week. Before I turn it over to Magdi and Ursula, I did want to provide 3 other updates. A referral from the Board of Directors asking us to take a look at the current legislation, which doesn't require transfer student athletes to meet percentage of degree at their leaving institution. We were asked to take a look at that. The committee did support a legislative concept to require transfers to meet progress towards degree, specifically percentage at the time of departure in order to be eligible upon transfer. 2 important topics the committee continues to monitor is the impact of NIL as well as transferring on academic performance of our student athletes. We're still really early on in the existence of both, especially on how we're going to collect data to determine if there is any impact. So they will continue to monitor that. And then I will touch on the referrals that came from the Transformation Committee in the next section. So with that, I will turn it over to Magdi and Ursula to see if they have any input, insights from the practitioner perspective.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking over the last year on the committee about the APR, when to return, if we would look at potentially going away from the 930 score and postseason loss of postseason opportunity if you fall below, whether there is a potential for a bias-based model that may work better. Today, as been mentioned, the thought was to return fully to normal operations. If anyone below 9 would receive a postseason ban. And so with as a practitioner, here is one I know in the last couple of years, a lot of our coaches around the country and talking to peers, you know, the perception was the APR is done. The APR is no a factor. And so getting maybe there's a sense of complacency that took place when it came to conversations in the last couple of years with academic staff and coaches about the impact on APR. Well, now we are returning in 2024. The scores are going to be publicly released. And if you haven't been tracking your APR data over the last 3 years, yeah, I'd highly recommend getting with your compliance staff or those who officially track that just to see what your scores are, project where you might fall this year, meet with any coaching staffs were scores falling close to that 930, just to make sure you are strategically discussing what you can do APRs. We do have to prepare for that public release that's going to be out in 2024.
I think also to follow up on Magdi's points, and I think it's great that the Committee on Academics has brought back the penalty phase, but I think it's also important to be mindful that the Committee on Academics is very attuned to the disproportionate impact APR has on certain schools. Serving on the COA between 2017 and 21, that was a topic that all members of the COA were in discussion with, including the chairs of the COA. So I just think it's important as N4A members that group that is making policy and looking at policy is listening to our N4A membership, is seeing the disproportionate impact and is very mindful of that. About a year ago, myself and Ryan Westman spoke to the COA, and we know Ryan Westman from NYU, a great N4A member, is very passionate about this subject. So I think I just want us as a group and a membership to know that group is attuned to the realities of APR and how it impacts different institutions.
The other thing I'd add that came out from the committee that you may have heard Ben speak to is the legislative proposal that requires student athletes to meet percentage of degree requirements at their previous institution in order to be eligible upon transfer. That had not been the case previous, but one of the things that we spent time and as a committee we pushed strongly for is we felt that it was unfair for the school from which a student athlete was transferred from, where that student athlete fell short of meeting PTD requirements at that transfer somewhere else and meet PTD requirements there and be immediately eligible. The previous institution in that case would lose not only APR points, but the student athlete would also show as a non-graduate in the GSR. And so felt strongly that the student athlete at their prior school needs to make sure that they met all requirements as if they were staying prior to being eligible to transfer at the ineligible.
Thank you so much. All great points. And really good insight there. I think these are all really important. And whether you are an academic advisor or even if you're just doing student athlete development, these are still things that you should be aware of because we are trying to develop the whole student athlete, and those other aspects will affect their academic performance. So thank you all so much. Going to keep things with Ben as we switch gears to the NCAA Transformation Committee. Just a reminder, if you have questions, feel free to post those in the Q&A and we will address as many as we can via text or during a live Q&A at the end of this session. So Ben, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Let us pivot to Committee on Academics to the Transformation Committee. Let's start with some background on where the Transformation Committee came from, as well as their focus. When the NCAA, specifically in Division I, Division II, and Division III also adopted a new constitution in January of 2022, the Transformation Committee was charged by the Board of Directors to modernize the NCAA and evolve with the changing landscape in which we saw happening in our profession, whether that be increased transfers, litigation, as well as the focus from Congress on college athletics. There was a need for us to continue to evolve. You'll see on the slide the areas of focus from the Transformation Committee. What they focused on early on was, what does it mean to be a member of Division I? What are the expectations? Is there a certain resource level? Those were the types of questions they were asked to look at. Is the way we are organized in Division I appropriate? Whether it's FBS to FCS to non-football, is that still an appropriate division for us to be in Division I? The last two is, in terms of governance, is the way we're making rules the best process for us? And should we look at the ways in which we're meeting the needs of our student athletes? And if there's a need for us to modernize as we move into the 21st century and meet the needs of our student athletes as the times, as I mentioned, continue to change and evolve before us. I would emphasize this last bullet point is that there was the expectation that this be a collaborative process, that groups such as N4A, the governance structure committees, the membership would provide input throughout this process. Before we go to the next slide, I would also note too, is that the environment continues to change, and you're reading it in the news every day about litigation, as I mentioned, Congress, and there is a need for us to continue to evolve as the environment around college athletics evolves as well. On this next slide, I did want to share the charge of the Transformation Committee, and which was chaired by Julie Cromer, Athletic Director at Ohio University, as well as Commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, Greg Sankey, is that they were charged with developing commitments, regulations, obligations that address the key issues we were seeing with our student athletes and member institutions. The next few slides does give you a sense of what the committee looked at and was charged with. The next slide will start with the area that was of utmost importance was making sure that we were providing our student athletes an enhanced experience, whether it be in the academics, mental health, well-being, that we were making sure that our student athletes were taken care of both academically, physically, and competitively as well. The next one was regulatory structure. Is there a need for us to look at the rules to determine should there be ones that are administered at the NCAA level? Is it better at the conference level or at the institutional level? And also for us to take a look at the enforcement structure to see if there's a need for us to be more timely, as well as should our focus be on the rules that are integral to the Division I collegiate model. Two more items on the next slide is an examination by the committee to determine that based on the financial support a school conference gives to student athletes, should that be a deciding factor on their representation in the governance structure, how much revenue distribution they receive, and also does that dictate championship access? As I mentioned earlier, membership was also an area they looked at to determine if we are structured appropriately and have, should there be divisions, another division perhaps for us to take a look at in the membership. And then lastly, on the next slide, similar to what I mentioned before, is there a need for us to look at our governance structure to see if there is a need for us to make sure we are making the decisions in the best process available? One concept that has come forward is a sport leadership model similar to what we have for men's and women's basketball right now and football, with the oversight committees that have authority over their sport. So that is currently in process. And if we go to the next slide, before we dive into some of the recommendations, these were the three areas that the TC Transformation Committee took a look at early on. A sport model that would support our student athletes in the evolving environment. Should we look at modernizing our rules and then examining the membership standards that each school should be meeting? I did pick out a few other recommendations, and we'll start with the holistic student athlete benefits model. These are, as we move into the 21st century, the benefits that each school should be providing our student athletes. Whether you're a school in California or a Tennessee to Rhode Island, these are the minimum expectations, a baseline expectations of what we should be providing our student athletes. Many of you are involved in these areas, such as degree completion, career counseling, advice. Also, you'll see the medical coverage, as well as required degree completion. These are all the minimum expectations in this holistic model for our student athletes as we move into the 21st century, and we should be providing these as a baseline to our student athletes. The next slide just provides a visual of the minimum requirements. Again, as I mentioned, many of you are involved in these areas, and when we finish up, I'll also touch on where these recommendations are going next. On the next slide is membership expectations. As I mentioned earlier, there was a desire for the board to ask the TC to look at the minimum membership requirements that our Division I schools should meet. These are the topical areas, and I'll touch base on several of them later on. Is, for example, compliance. You should be doing an audit every 3 years, similarly to what we previously had. Should there be financial aid minimums? Is attendance the appropriate way for us to look at FBS football requirements? So this just gives you an idea of the minimum membership expectations that the TC is looking at. Another area in which I know many of you are involved is, whether it's at the conference level or at the institutional level, is involved in committees with your student athletes. You'll see here both requirements for the conference and institutions for your SAC to have oversight by your senior staff and then an executive team. We heard that from our student athletes. I wanted to highlight this since many of you are involved with your SACs on campus or at the conference level. On the next slide is decentralization. And when we talk about decentralization, we're talking about modernizing the rules and also determining where the appropriate level of oversight and administration of rules should be. These were the initial concepts given. Many of these will be covered by the Modernization of Rules Subcommittee. For example, athletics eligibility is there consideration for a model where our student athletes have 5 years of eligibility within 5 years, within their 5-year clock. Also recruiting, official visits, should that be deregulated rather than having the limitations we currently have in place? So these were some of the topics that were on the initial slate for us to look at to modernize. Next slide, please. All right, I did want to spend some time to go over the recommendations that came to the Committee on Academics. The first two we already touched on, which was monitoring transfers and then the percentage of degree requirement for our student athletes who want to transfer. The first one I did want to highlight is the standalone transfer graduation metric. What this would, in theory, would require a school to meet a standalone graduation metric with a benchmark to be determined by the committee that if it is not met, that the school would be, for example, have penalties, which could include loss of access to postseason. They're unable to take on transfers for a certain period of time. Those types of requirements, similar to the metric we're using with APR and the penalty structure, should there be one for transfers. And the Committee on Academics did take a look at this last week and decided not to take action, but rather collect 3 years of data and then come back to this, since the transferring that we are seeing is a newer phenomena with the advent of the one-time transfer rule being now applicable to the 5 additional sports. So that's where we are on the transfer graduation metric. Before I turn it over to Magdi and Ursula, I did want to highlight the last one, which was in the membership expectations. Is there an APR benchmark that a school needs to meet in order to demonstrate that it is meeting membership expectations in the area of academic support? In this concept, if the school didn't meet it, would it be required to add academic support staff, put an APR improvement plan in place, those types of corrective measures before we have additional penalties? The Committee on Academics was uncomfortable having an additional metric. We already have the 930 for the penalties as well as access to postseason and a structure in place with the penalty structure, and felt that that was sufficient. So I'll stop there to turn it over to Magdi and Ursula.
Thank you, Ben. I think the work of the Transformation Committee, the approval from Council and the board is significantly going to impact our membership and what we do. While it might not change day to day, because I think a lot of us are offering a significant amount of support, it might mean it's time for us to continue to advocate for our units and for the support that we offer our student athletes to senior administration within our department, because maybe we need to shore some of those pieces up. That might mean in staffing, in services. So I think this is impactful on us. And while it might not change metrics and PTDs and APR, there is a standard across Division I that we all need to meet now, whether it's using campus services or our own services which I think really needs to be clarified within the work that's going on. But certainly, perhaps we need more resources flowing to these support units, including our medical teams, to best meet these metrics, and also be more mindful, and we're already mindful as a group, but be even more mindful of the voice of the student athlete and making sure that voice is getting to senior administration. I think a lot of us work closely with the students, but how do we connect the student athletes with our athletics directors and chancellors and presidents to make sure that their voice is at the highest reaches with some of this stuff that's going on?
Yeah, in addition to what Ursula is commenting on, I know we're all very concerned about the landscape with transfers, institutions, and there's a lot of discussion about it. And at this point, it is too early to make major decisions, since already as it is, I know effective next year, our coaching staffs who are taking on transfers on scholarship are required to provide them and make them a counter that they stay on campus or not. There's a couple exceptions to that, but some of the additional this time has been mentioned wasn't worth pursuing and adding that on, where our coaches might have something on them without fully understanding the transfer environment. Well, now with that said, I know speaking to our colleagues on campuses, what we're seeing now are a lot more mid-year transfers who are enrolling in the institution. So that's putting pressure to admit them late in terms of not only admission, sometimes in the third week of the semester, late in their academic careers, where people are transferring as seniors, PTD requirements or programs that they could get into. So there is a tension that's going on with practitioners about trying to figure out, how do we make this all? A lot of talk about that. So the committee's mindful on that. We're collecting more data, and expect more to be coming down the pipe in the years to come.
I think another piece to also be mindful with this holistic model is also all of our conferences might also interpret some of these things differently. So sometimes conferences are going to coalesce around certain ideas and come together and perhaps mandate or ask that something be done within these student athlete models. So I think there's many ways in which the transformation committee's recommendations are going to be applied on our campus level and impact the work that we do, in particular those in of us Division I, because this is now part of sustaining a Division I membership.
Ursula, thanks for that. I know I promised to share where these recommendations would go next. The 43-page report from the Transformation Committee is out there. There's a handy chart in the back of the report that provides all the recommendations that came from the TC, in addition to the timeline. Where these recommendations are going, similar to what I just went over with COA and the referrals, is they're going to be referred out to the appropriate committee structure that has oversight over that area. So membership generally will go to Strategic Vision and Planning and Finance Committee. And the championships will go to the various championship committee that oversee that sport. So my recommendation would take a look at that 43-page report. Also, just be on the lookout for news as committees are examining their recommendations and then providing their feedback to the Division I Council and the TC on where these recommendations should land.
Thank you for that additional information, Ben. I think it's really important. This is a potentially multi-year ramp up on some of these things. And I think great points were made by both Ursula and Dr. Magdi. Open the lines of communication with your senior staff. Make sure that you are aware of what's going on. And I think hopefully the senior staff will be talking to people at the conference levels, because that's a great point Ursula made, that conferences may be mandating different things as well, or providing resources and recommendations for their conference schools. So appreciate all three of you very much. I'm actually going to throw it over to Cecily Taylor for our Q&A. So we're going to start with the questions that we have in there, and then if we have time, take any additional questions. Cecily, all yours.
Thanks, Rachel. We'll start with questions we have in the Q&A and then open up to live questions from the attendees if we have time. So this first one's to Ben. Did the review address the differences of APR, GSR in HBCUs and lower resource institutions compared to other schools? Were the same results found?
Thanks for that question. And I know Ursula did touch on this in her remarks when I went over the APR review. Just so folks know, we did have a review of the filters, the penalty structure, in addition to the support we provide the HBCUs and LRIs as part of the academic performance program. As part of the review too, we also brought in individuals that worked at HBCUs as well as LRIs to give their perspectives on the APR and what APR and GSR has been impactful on their campuses. And what they found was that it has been a motivator for increased academic performance. What the committee also did mention as part of the recommendations was that there should be increased education for those teams and schools that have scores below 930, in addition to increased efforts to help our limited resource institutions and HBCUs throughout the process. So those were some of the recommendations that the committee did approve moving forward for the LRIs and HBCUs related to the comprehensive APR review.
And Ben, just a quick follow-up, but just from an N4A perspective, please keep in mind that N4A leadership offers quite a few services for HBCU, LRI institutions in order to best assist with APR and GSR best practices. So I just want to keep that in mind that N4A itself offers a lot and gives back to our membership in this space to help HBCU and LRI institutions.
Thanks, Ursula. I actually will throw it back to you for this next question. Does the panel have any observations about the impact of mental health on student-athlete academic success? And are your departments engaging in any best practices to combat any negative impact of mental health on academic success?
That is a tough question, but I think I appreciate the notion of observation. I think mental health is serious. I think all of our students, coaches, staff really are dealing with it to different degrees. And I think mental health does impact the academic success and progress of our student athletes, and we need to be mindful of that. I believe one of the last reports that came out from NCAA research, who does an excellent job in gathering this data, showed that academics was the #1 stressor on our student athletes. And I think one of the best practices that we try to do here at UMKC is really partner with campus, not just campus mental health services, but also getting in front of our faculty, working together as a unit, as a team to best help our student athletes. We cannot operate in silos to help our student athletes in the mental health space, working with our coaches, dialoguing with them, talking directly to our medical team and making sure our medical team's connected to our academic team, all the people that touch our student athletes, including our faculty, to figure out how do we best help them and lead with compassion and empathy in this space for our student athletes. And I know Magdi probably has some great follow-up too.
Yeah, I mean, not a whole lot to add to what you just said, Ursula. I know mental health, like you mentioned, like we all know, it is a big concern, probably the chief concern. As we look at what we're doing, we've actually expanded our mental health program and personnel and staff athletes, but really being proactive. I know the NC to the impact of mental health on academic performance with respect to waivers. So best advice is if you see the impact, make sure your student athletes are plugged into campus and keep that documentation, because at some point there may be a less than full-time waiver or a midterm exception, things of that nature that mental health mental health can provide and take off some pressure from a student athlete and that might contribute to some of their own mental health and feeling like I have to do all this now. I'm behind academically. There is that relief with the proper servicing and documentation that you should consider.
Thank you, Emmett, for that question. That was really great. Last question to Magdi. Would meeting PTD be in any degree at their previous institution or their designated degree program?
For a student athlete who has had more than four full semesters, they would have to meet it in their degree. They'd have to be fully eligible as if they to take advantage of being able to transfer and be immediately eligible. For student athletes who are ending and just completed their fourth full-time term, you could use the degree for meeting that 40%. Obviously, those who are less than four full-time terms don't have a PTD benchmark.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to throw it back to Zach to conclude us.
Thank you, everyone, to the presenters for this awesome information. It was a great webinar. Do any of you have any final words before we close?
Zach, thank you, first of all, to the opportunity. It's great to be with N4A family. I think it's one of the best families out there, so it's great to be here. I think just a few closing thoughts. As our landscape's changing and evolving, and we're growing with it, which is a great thing. I think we have to look at this as a positive. I think it's really important to try to keep up as best as possible, reading the ticker, reading the news with the landscape, because there's a lot going on, especially at the congressional level, in the court system. So take a look at the Student Athlete Bill of Rights, Google it. That's almost somewhat of a roadmap if we're looking at Congress. So Student Athlete Bill of Rights, there was employment news coming out of yesterday from the court. So I think as N4A members, while we do a great job in academics and student athlete development, DE&I, I think it's also important for us as leaders to advocate for ourselves, but to also know what is going on around us in the national landscape at very high levels, because that will help educate us and help us best understand the path in which we're taking our student athletes on.
Said, great comments there. The other thing I'd add in addition is, these are tough times. And we'll work with student athletes. We talk about we're providing support the best we can, but we got to lean on each other. You got to make sure you're taking care of yourselves. We're taking care of them. The old saying is, who's taking care of the people who are taking care of the people who are taking care of everyone. But we got to do the best job of taking care of us, making sure you can employ work-life balance the best you can. Get involved with N4A. Talk around the country within your conference. You'll find a lot of people are sharing similar experiences. And I know at the convention, whether you're at the convention or not, just sharing best practices and sometimes seeing that we're all experiencing the same thing can be sort of just to know you're not in it alone.
Those are great words from both of you, and thank you for that. So on behalf of the N4A leadership, I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to provide the content. Also to the membership, a recording of this webinar will be located. I just dropped some information in the chat. So attendees, we appreciate you being here and just ask that you take a moment to complete the brief survey. Just a couple questions for us, please. Thanks everyone, and have a great conclusion to your spring or winter term.
Thank you.